Ah, the Battletoads. Hard not to love these three putrid pugilists. Putrid pugilists? Who writes this? These are three really big green dudes who just enjoy punching stuff. And with two of their top games back in action on Rare Replay, let's take a trip through the world of 90s game development with 5 things you didn't know about this most hard-hitting of series. Hard-hitting because it's got a big anvil for a fist. To understand the thinking behind Battletoads, it probably helps to understand some of the games that led up to it, not to mention the artist's fascination with poking around in ponds. Genuinely.
I think my first licensed game that I was actually in control of doing the graphics myself was WWF Superstars or WWF WrestleMania, one of the two. And it was my first attempt at any animation. And there was very little wrestling actually in the game. It was more punching and kicking. I think there was a point when we stopped doing the licensed games because although they were fun to work on, they were very, very restrictive. And that kind of thing always got in the way of development. And so I think we decided after a while to stop doing so many licensed products and move into our own stuff. And so that's when we started creating characters like Battletoads and Snake Rattle and Roll and Banjo and all the good guys. I remember that we wanted to make our own characters for a platform beat-em-up. I can remember I sat there with Tim talking about what we were going to use for these characters, and we decided on Toads because I was really into pond life and stuff like that. When I was a kid, I was a real geek and really into nature. Tim looked at the idea and he drew a few sketches up and says, go ahead and draw some. So we went through all kinds of ideas and names. I spent time putting a style guide together while Tim got on with doing the artwork for the game. And he worked on that with Mark whilst I carried on producing the style guide. I think after that I might have worked on the Battletoads on the Game Boy. And then from that I went on to work on the coin-op game with Greg Mayles and Chris Sutherland. That was a fun game to work on because we could put a lot more colour and a lot more animation into that.
Want an insight into early 90s tech? Then brace yourselves, we're going all in with floppy disks and graph paper.
When I started at Rare, one of the things that surprised me was the way that we got the graphics from the artist to the engineer. The artist would create their illustration on tracing paper and then they would trace over that with little squares to basically make a matrix to show the pixels and then put in the colors. They would then hand that sheet to someone called a graphics decoder. They would look at those squares and then they would type in the relevant hexadecimal numbers into a file. They would then save that onto a floppy disk and then they would hand that floppy disk to the engineer. So I'd get a list of hex numbers that I'd put in and then I put those on screen. You'd find sometimes the little glitchy parts in there, at which point you'd either have to work out what was the problem yourself or you'd hand it back to this other person. So that was quite a surprise.
A finely tuned machine, that's what it was. Now come on Chris, you know what we want. Tell us the story about Kev's disc.
On Battletoads Arcade, to transfer the graphics to the engineer rather than today where you just send them an email or place it on a file share somewhere, it was much more old school. So Kevin would save out the graphics onto his master disc. I always remember the disc that Kevin used to hand me the graphics on. It used to say Kevin's Master Dick. I didn't know if that was just a typo or whether that was intentional.
We're hoping that's a Batman reference, something Alfred would say to Robin. Hopefully. Moving on. One thing that's had eagle-eyed fans speculating over the years is a specific screenshot on the back of the Battletoads box. If only we could find a designer who knows what happened and drag him into a shed to explain.
I did a little bit of work on the NES version. I did some level design on that, certainly some of the later levels, including one level that we designed, and it was actually on the back of the box. There was a picture of this level. It was like this furnace level where it was a bit like the speeder tunnel, but instead of being on a bike, you had like this little steamroller, and it was a good level to play. But we decided it was too similar to the turbo tunnel, so we took it out and replaced it with what was Volkmar's Inferno, where you're on like a kind of a plane. It was like Scramble-esque going through, but by then all the screenshots had been done for the box, so the box actually came out with the old level on it, but it wasn't actually in the final game.
Deadlines, always causing trouble. We wish we could punch you until you fall over and disappear. No, not you, Greg. It's always tricky nailing the difficulty balance of a game. Obviously, the original Battletoads managed it perfectly, but arcade games are a different beast. How do you plan for that, and get a sense of what your players are thinking?
What was interesting about the development of Super Battletoads Arcade was that it was the first time we'd actually had a designer working on the game day to day. So there was a point where Greg came to work on the game, and the way we developed that was essentially he would sit right next to me and I would be coding the game. We'd discuss what needed to happen, and then I'd start typing things in.
Joel Hochberg was his kind of original business was in the arcade industry, and that's how Tim and Chris started originally with PCB boards, and that's how they got introduced to Joel. So Joel always had this arcade business. He owned a couple of arcades. I guess the Stamper saw it as just another challenge to actually go into a different industry and try and do something different.
So that's the planning. Now what about those clever ideas for getting feedback that didn't involve teams just pitching a tent in an arcade?
For Battletoads Arcade, when we needed to test the game, we wanted to see what people's reactions were. We wanted to see what the players were able to do, what they thought about it, but we didn't want to stand next to them and ask them questions, because obviously they're not going to tell us what they really think. So we came up with this cunning plan where we knew that Joel had an arcade in the US, so we put a VCR inside the cabinet and we recorded the game, and then a microphone outside recorded what people were saying. So then we watched that back and watched people playing, watched all the different actions they were doing and what they were saying and which bits they liked, which bits they didn't like, and we were able to make some tweaking to the game based on that.
How it turned out, I think it turned out really well. I guess I was slightly disappointed I didn't see as many of them around as I was hoping, having worked on it, but I think the bespoke nature of the cabinet with 3 players made it quite expensive.
But it's all good, because 21 years on, Rare Replay brought it crashing right into your living room for the first time ever. Justice for Battletoads Arcade. We've heard about the Lost Battletoads level, but what if there was a whole handheld game that never came out? How mad would that be? A brief history of Battletoads on the Game Boy coming right up.
One of the things I've been responsible for here over the years was that I've actually written 4 Battletoad games on the Nintendo Game Boy, on the original Game Boy, back in the early to mid-90s. The funny thing about it was that originally Mark Betteridge had been writing the first Battletoad game on the NES console, and Tim came to me and asked me if I would do a port of that, and I actually said no to him. And when he asked me why, I said, well, you know what, most of the work for doing a port is the same work I've got to do if we do an original one. People are more likely to buy an original offshoot of Mark's game. Tim let me go with it, and so the first Battletoad game on the Game Boy, although it's got the same name as the NES game, is actually a different game based on the same universe and with some similar art assets on a couple of the levels. Kevin Bayliss and I created a load of new levels and assets and went off on a tangent from that.
But hold your horses, Internet. We're not classing that as the game that got away. There's more to it.
We did a couple more Battletoad games that had crossover and similarities with other console versions that were being produced later on. And the 4th Battletoad game you haven't seen. Hasn't come out yet, but it was heavily rendered and it looked wonderful. And it was a spin-off from a coin-op arcade game.
It was just a little too late in the day to be viable for the Game Boy market, but you can still play the no-holds-barred arcade original. Also worth noting that true to Battletoads' reputation, 2 decades on, we still had to hack this lost Game Boy game just to be able to get to the end. Oh, Battletoads. And that takes us up to 5 things. We've been counting on our fingers! Thanks for joining us. And if you need to unwind after that hefty knowledge intake, fire up Rare Replay and kick some bad space pigs right in the face. They asked for it. See ya!
Stompin' time!
If you enjoyed that, like and subscribe. And if you missed our other recent Battletoads video, we've given you a handy link right here. If it's the old numbered list that you like, try our 5 things about Blastcore. And finally, for the full Making of Battletoads feature, grab Rare Replay for Xbox One. It's full of good stuff.